Mara Voss had not flown in 3 years, not really. She had sat in airplane seats twice since the funeral. Once for her sister's wedding in Denver, once for a work conference she could not get out of. But she had not flown. Flying was something else. Flying was watching the wing flex against the clouds and knowing, in her hands and her spine, exactly what the pilots up front were doing at every second. Sitting in seat 22C on a Tuesday morning flight from Chicago to Lisbon, gripping a paperback she wasn't reading, Mara was only a passenger. She had trained herself to be only a passenger. It took effort, like holding a door shut against wind. She was 44 years old, and for 11 of those years she had been a first officer for a regional cargo carrier. And for 4 of those years she had been married to a man named Daniel Reyes, who flew the same routes, in the same planes, sometimes in the seat beside her. Dan had died in a training accident in a flight simulator that malfunctioned during a routine session. A freak electrical fault that nobody could have predicted and everybody had since studied to exhaustion. Simulator, not aircraft. He had never left the ground. It was, people told her afterward, almost a comfort, that he hadn't been afraid, that there had been no plummet, no view out a window at the earth rising up. Mara had never found this a comfort. She had found it almost worse, that the machine built to be safe had been the thing that killed him. She had been the one to identify his body, because there had been no one else the hospital could reasonably call first, and she remembered very little about that day except the strange, clinical calm that had come over her in the moment itself and abandoned her completely the moment she left the building. People who knew what she did for a living sometimes assumed, gently, that being a pilot herself must have made the loss easier to understand, as though grief were a system that could be studied and therefore managed. It had not worked that way. If anything, understanding exactly how a simulator's electrical systems were supposed to fail safe, and exactly how rarely a failure like the one that killed Dan was supposed to happen, had made it harder, not easier. A freak accident dressed up in numbers she could recite, and none of which brought him back or explained, in any way that satisfied her, why it had been him. For a long time afterward, she had measured her days by what she could and could not make herself do. She could get out of bed. She could not, for the first 8 months, drive past the flight school where they'd met. She could go back to work, eventually, in a windowless office that had nothing to do with airplanes, and find that she was good at logistics in the same quiet, competent way she had once been good at flying. The skills were adjacent. She came to understand, both of them built out of the same instinct to see a complicated system clearly and keep it moving safely from one point to another. She could not, in 3 years, sit in a cockpit. She had told herself this was simply grief taking its shape, the way grief takes whatever shape it needs to survive in a particular person, and she had mostly stopped questioning it. It was easier to accept a limit than to keep testing where, exactly, it came from. She quit flying 6 weeks later. Not officially. She took a leave of absence that became a resignation that became, eventually, a new life entirely, working logistics for a shipping firm in Chicago. A job that let her think about airplanes without touching one. She had not sat at a set of controls since. She had barely spoken about aviation at all, not to her sister, not to the therapist she saw for 8 months and then stopped seeing, not to the 2 men she had dated since and quietly let go of when the conversation moved anywhere near what she used to do. The flight to Lisbon was for her mother, who was turning 70 and wanted the family together at a rented villa on the coast. Mara had put off booking for months, and then bought the ticket in a rush of guilt at 11 at night. And now here she was back a plane, in a window seat she'd specifically requested, because at least a window seat let her look at something other than the seat back in front of her. She had almost canceled twice. Once when the confirmation email arrived and the airline's logo, a stylized bird she'd stared at 1,000 times on 1,000 old paychecks in a different life, had made her hands go cold on her keyboard for no reason she could explain to herself. And once again that morning, standing in airport security with her shoes half off, watching a pilot crew walk past in their creased uniforms and rolling bags, laughing about something easy in their bodies, the way she used to be easy in hers. She had wanted badly to turn around and go home. She hadn't. She told herself that was progress, boarding anyway, and maybe it was. Grief had taught her that progress rarely looked like triumph. Mostly it looked like doing the smaller, harder thing instead of the easier, smaller thing over and over, until one day you noticed you'd build a life out of it. Her mother had asked her, on the phone the week before, whether she was nervous about the flight. Mara had said no, too quickly, the way she always did, and her mother, who had watched her daughter fold in on herself for 3 years with the particular helpless patience of a parent who cannot fix grief, only stand near it, had let the lie pass without comment, the way she always did too. There was a version of this trip where Mara talked to her mother honestly about any of it, about Dan, about the simulator, about the strange fact that she had loved flying so much and lost it so completely the same week she lost him, as though the two things had never really been separable at all. She had not managed that conversation yet. She told herself there would be time in Lisbon. The cabin was maybe 2/3 full. A flight attendant named Priya moved down the aisle with a drink cart, calm and quick in the way of someone who had done this 10,000 times. Across the aisle, a boy of about 9 was playing a handheld game with the sound off, his mother asleep beside him with a travel pillow crushed against the window. 2 rows up, a man in a suit was already annoyed about something with his headphones. Ordinary. Mara let herself relax by increments, the way she taught herself to, counting the small, ordinary details until her shoulders came down from around her ears. This was the ritual she'd built for herself over 3 years of occasional, necessary flying as a passenger. Name 5 ordinary things, and let the ordinariness of them stand in for safety, because her body no longer trusted safety as an abstract idea, only as a collection of small, boring, specific facts. A sleeping stranger, a bored businessman, a child's game with the volume off, a drink cart's quiet rattle, the particular gray light of high altitude coming through a window she wasn't sitting quite close enough to touch. 5 things, and then usually her pulse would settle enough to let her open a book she had no real intention of reading, holding it more as a prop than a text, a signal to herself and to the world that she was a person doing an ordinary thing on an ordinary flight, not a woman who used to sit in the front of planes like this one and had for 3 years been unable to imagine doing so again. She thought, as she often did in these in-between hours over open water, of Dan's hands, not his face, which she could still summon perfectly, and which therefore did not frighten her, but his hands, which she found she missed with an intensity that surprised her every time, calloused across the first knuckle from years of gripping a yoke, quick and precise on switches and dials, steady in exactly the way his voice had also been steady, in the cockpit and out of it. She used to tease him that he flew a plane the way he loaded a dishwasher, methodical to the point of being slightly insufferable, everything in its place before he'd let himself relax. He used to tell her that was rich, coming from the only first officer he'd ever flown, with who color-coded her checklists. They had built an entire marriage, she sometimes thought, out of 2 people who found competence unbearably attractive in each other, which was a strange thing to have built a marriage out of, and also, she thought, possibly the truest thing about who they had been together. They were 4 hours into the flight over the Atlantic, cruising at 31,000 feet, when the airplane tried to kill everyone in it. There was no warning that Mara's body registered as a warning, though later, in interviews, she would recall a strange thinning quality to the air just before a pressure behind her ears she'd dismissed as ordinary altitude discomfort. Then there was a sound like a gunshot deep in the structure of the plane, a bang that came from somewhere behind and above her, and the cabin dropped into chaos in under 2 seconds. The oxygen masks fell first, small yellow cups swinging down from the panels above every seat, a sight Mara had seen exactly once before, years ago, in a training simulator, and never in real life. Then the air itself seemed to leave the cabin all at once, a rushing, sucking pressure that popped ears and stole breath and turned the boy across the aisle's silent game into a scream Mara couldn't hear over the roaring wind noise now filling the plane. Somewhere near the back, a passenger's laptop bag lifted off a seat and slid down the aisle floor like it had a mind of its own. The plane banked hard, nose tipping, and Mara's stomach rose into her throat as the aircraft began an emergency descent, engines screaming with the effort of getting to breathable air as fast as physics allowed. She had the mask on her face before she consciously decided to put it there. Her hands remembered 11 years of drills, even if the rest of her had spent 3 years trying to forget. She looked around through mask fog plastic. Priya, the flight attendant, was down the aisle bracing herself against a seat back, her own mask on, gesturing at passengers to keep theirs on, to stay seated, mouthing words that the cabin noise ate before they reached anyone. Then the noise changed. Not louder, different. A groan of metal Mara felt in her teeth, and a long, wrong shudder through the floor. She looked at the boy across the aisle. He had his mask on, but his mother didn't. She was awake now, fumbling, her hands shaking too hard to work the simple plastic tube, and Mara was out of her seatbelt before she'd finished thinking about it, crossing the aisle in the pitching cabin, pulling the mask down over the woman's face herself, holding it there until the woman's hands finally steadied enough to hold it on her own. "Thank you," the woman tried to say, muffled, and Mara just nodded. Because there wasn't time, because something in the front of the plane had gone wrong in a way that was different from a hole in the fuselage. And she could feel it the way she used to feel wrong engine sounds through the yoke of an aircraft, a kind of knowing that lived in her hands more than her ears. The plane leveled out of its steep dive around 10,000 feet, air breathable again. The roaring quieted to something closer, to ordinary flight noise, plus the low, continuous whistle of a pressurization system that had failed and not fully recovered. But the plane wasn't flying right. Mara had spent enough hours in the air to know the difference between an aircraft under control and one that was being flown by someone fighting it. And this one was being fought. Priya's voice came over the intercom, tight and trying to sound calm and not quite managing it. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We are dealing with a technical issue and ask for your patience and cooperation." It was the phrase "technical issue" that made Mara's stomach drop harder than the depressurization had. Technical issue was what you said when you didn't yet know how bad it was, or when you knew and didn't want to say. 2 minutes later, Priya came through the cabin herself, moving fast, scanning rows, and Mara understood before the woman even reached her seat that something had gone very wrong up front. Priya crouched by 22C, her professional calm cracking at the edges. "Ma'am, I'm sorry to ask this, but the manifest. You're listed with an aviation background. Commercial pilot license." Mara's mouth went dry. Yes. I haven't flown in 3 years." The captain took a piece of debris to the head during the decompression event. "He's unconscious. The first officer is flying, but he's got a laceration on his arm we can't get to stop bleeding fast enough. And he says," Priya swallowed, "he says he doesn't think he can hold the aircraft and manage the injury both. We need someone in that cockpit who knows what they're looking at. Please." Mara sat very still for 1 full second, feeling the entire architecture of the last 3 years, the leave of absence, the resignation, the promise she'd made to herself in a hospital corridor never to sit at a set of controls again, collapse at once, like a building giving way floor by floor. Then she unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up. The ER nurse from row 6, a compact, gray-haired woman named Louise, who introduced herself in the 4 seconds it took to pass her, fell into step just behind Mara without being asked, the two of them moving forward through the cabin together, like something had already decided they belonged to the same small unit of people now. Behind them, Priya was working the aisle in the opposite direction, checking rows, resetting the mother's oxygen line, telling a teenager 2 rows back in a voice that allowed no argument to please stay seated. The cabin in those 60 feet told its own story. A woman near the emergency exit had her rosary wound so tightly around her knuckles the beads had left white marks. A man in business class had his laptop open and was typing with hands that shook too hard to hit the right keys, as though finishing an email might somehow anchor him to the ordinary world he'd been in 20 minutes earlier. A flight attendant Mara didn't recognize. Younger, knew enough that his hands were shaking too, though he was trying hard not to let it show, was crouched beside an elderly passenger, holding an oxygen bottle steady, murmuring something Mara couldn't hear, but recognized instantly as the practiced cadence of someone reciting calm they didn't fully feel yet, because that was also a skill, faking it competently enough that the fake became temporarily true. Mara understood, walking through all of it, that fear moved through an airplane cabin the way a temperature moved through water, not instantly, but steadily, filling every space it could reach unless something interrupted it. She had been that interruption for the mother across the aisle. Now she was walking toward the one place on the aircraft where an interruption might matter more than anywhere else. At the cockpit door, Priya's voice crackled once more over the interphone to the first officer inside, brief and clipped, confirming Mara's approach. The door, reinforced steel built to keep threats out, swung inward instead to let one in, though threat was not the right word for what Mara was. She was the opposite of a threat. She reminded herself, the only qualified thing standing between 211 people and whatever came next. She stepped through. The walk from 22C to the cockpit was the length of an airplane, perhaps 60 feet, and it took Mara longer than any distance she had ever crossed. Passengers watched her, without understanding why a woman in jeans and a gray sweater was being escorted forward by the flight attendant with such urgency. Somewhere behind her, she heard the mother she'd helped saying something to the boy, a low, steady, reassuring voice, and it struck Mara absurdly in the middle of everything. That competence was contagious, that seeing one person act with purpose made it easier for the next person to hold themselves together too. She would need to be that person now. For 211 strangers and one bleeding man in a cockpit, she would need to be the calm at the center. The cockpit door was cracked open, Priya having already alerted the first officer over the interphone. Inside, the sight hit Mara like cold water. The captain, a heavy-set man in his 50s, slumped against his harness, a dark, wet patch matting the hair above his ear, unconscious but breathing. She registered that immediately. Some old training reflex, checking for the thing that mattered most before anything else. The first officer, a younger man whose name tag read T. Okafor, had blood soaking through a makeshift bandage on his forearm, wrapped in what looked like a torn shirt sleeve. His face gray with blood loss and effort. Both hands locked on the controls, sweat running into his eyes. "Who are you?" he said, not really a question, more of a demand for information he needed fast. "Mara Voss. 11 years commercial cargo carrier. Out of the industry 3 years. I know this aircraft type. I flew this model for 6 of those years." Her voice came out steadier than she expected. It surprised her enough that some small, stunned part of her mind noted the fact and set it aside for later. "Okafor, first officer. I've got a laceration that won't stop, and I am not going to be able to hold this aircraft stable much longer. My grip's going." He was talking fast, professional shorthand even through obvious pain, the two of them falling instantly into the clipped cadence of pilots who had never met but spoke the same language. "We lost cabin pressure from a door seal failure. We think, still confirming. Emergency descent complete. We're stable at 10,000. Autopilots engaged, but fighting an asymmetric trim issue I haven't had hands free to diagnose. Captain took debris to the skull when the door blew. He's out I don't know for how long." Mara looked at the vacant seat, the captain's seat, the left seat, the seat she had never once flown from because in her career she had always been the first officer, the second in command, the one who watched and backed up and never had final authority over an aircraft in flight. She had told herself for 3 years that the reason she couldn't go back to flying was Dan, was grief, was the simulator and the electrical fault and the unfairness of it. Some more honest version of herself, standing in this doorway now, understood that part of it had always been this too. A fear of exactly this moment, of being the only person left responsible. "I need you in the right seat," Okafor said. "I can talk you through anything aircraft specific you don't know, but I need someone flying with me. Not just watching me. My arm's going numb." She sat down. The headset went on like a second skin, familiar in a way that made her chest ache, the particular pressure of it against her ears, the smell of the vinyl seat, the geometry of instruments in front of her that her hands still knew even though her mind had spent 3 years insisting she'd forgotten. Her fingers found the yoke and closed around it, and something in her grief, fear, the old competence, all of it at once, settled, briefly, into something almost like stillness. "Talk to me," she said. "Everything. Start with the trim." Air traffic control had been holding the frequency since the decompression, patient and professional. A voice that had clearly done this before even if it had never done exactly this. "November 47 Bravo. Be advised we have you level at 10,000. Understand you have a medical emergency and a flight crew injury. Please advise intentions when able." Okafor keyed the radio with his good hand, voice tight. Approach, for 7 Bravo, we've got a former commercial pilot in the right seat assisting. Captain is unconscious with a head injury. I have a laceration limiting my mobility. Requesting immediate diversion and priority handling. We'll need medical on the ground. There was a pause on the radio. Half a second, no more. And then the voice came back, and something in it changed register, dropped its professional neutrality, just slightly, became a man rather than a call sign. For 7 Bravo, copy all, diverting you to Shannon. That's your nearest suitable, distance 190 miles. I'll get you vectors and the weather now. For 7 Bravo, this is Controller Sean Hollis. I want you to know I flew cargo out of the same base as Reyes Voskrew years back. I know what a right seat with real hands feels like. You're gonna do fine. Mara's whole body went cold and then hot. Reyes Voskrew. Not a coincidence of language. He knew the call sign, the crew pairing, from years ago, from before, from when she had still been Voss and Reyes. The two names dispatchers used to say together because she and Dan had flown together, so often it became a kind of shorthand. This controller, this stranger's voice in her headset, had known her husband, had maybe worked traffic under one of their old flights. She did not have time for this. She had a trim issue, and an unconscious captain, and a first officer losing blood, and a controller. She needed to be a set of coordinates and vectors, not a ghost. She pushed the thought down into the same place she'd been pushing Dan for 3 years, and made herself speak. Approach, for 7 Bravo, copy diversion to Shannon, requesting the trim advisory. We've got an asymmetric issue since the emergency descent. Copy, for 7 Bravo, standing by, sending your vectors now. Hollis's voice was all business again, the moment closed, professional. But Mara could hear underneath it. The same thing she'd heard in her own voice a minute ago. The sound of someone holding a door shut against something enormous. Okafor talked her through the trim system in short, controlled bursts between winces of pain. The door seal failure had apparently sent a cascade fault through one of the stabilizer trim motors, and the autopilot was compensating with a workaround that wouldn't hold once they began their approach descent and needed manual control. Mara listened, translated it against 11 years of memory, and found, to her quiet astonishment, that the knowledge was there, whole, undamaged, exactly where she'd left it. Grief had not erased her training. It had only made her afraid to use it. There's a manual trim, will down by your knee, Okafor said, nodding toward it without letting go of the yoke. If the electric trim fails completely, that's your backup, but it's slow, and it'll fight you the whole way. I'd rather we not need it. Understood. Mara ran her eyes across the overhead panel, the rows of switches and breakers that had once been as familiar to her as her own kitchen, and now required a half-second of conscious searching before her hand found each one. Muscle memory reasserting itself switch by switch like a limb waking up from having fallen asleep. She found the pressurization panel first, confirmed what Okafor had already told her, outflow valve reading abnormal, consistent with a seal failure rather than a structural breach, which meant at least that they weren't flying an airplane with a hole in it, only one that couldn't hold its breath properly anymore. It was, she thought, an oddly fitting failure for the day she'd chosen to get back on a plane. She pushed the thought away and kept working. Fuel state's fine. We've got more than enough for Shannon with reserves, Okafor went on. Engines are both healthy. This isn't a power problem. It's a pressurization, and now a flight control problem stacked on top of each other. I need you cross-checking my instruments against yours the whole way down, because I don't trust my own reads right now. I'm losing more blood than I'd like. Copy. I've got your 6, Mara said, an old phrase from her cargo days, and felt Okafor's shoulders drop half an inch at hearing it, the particular relief of a pilot realizing the person beside him spoke fluent emergency, not just polite reassurance. I need you to take primary controls when we start descent into Shannon, Okafor said. I can work the radios and the checklist with one hand. I could talk you through anything aircraft specific, but I cannot hold this yoke through an approach with the trim doing what it's doing. You're going to have to fly this in. I haven't flown an approach in 3 years, Mara said. It came out flat, not panicked, just true. I've flown 140 approaches in the last 3 years, and I can't hold this yoke steady right now, Okafor said. It's not about who's flown more recently. It's about whose hands work. Yours work. Behind them, muffled through the closed cockpit door, Mara could hear the low murmur of 200 people trying not to be afraid. Hollis came back once more before the workload swallowed the silence between transmissions entirely. For 7 Bravo, be advised Shannon's rescue services are being briefed now, and I got a company representative from your carrier standing by on a landline if you need anything relayed. How's your first officer doing? Okafor answered before Mara could, his voice thinner than it had been 5 minutes earlier. Approach for 7 Bravo. I'm hanging in, bleeding slowed some with direct pressure. Priority is getting this aircraft down. Copy that, Hollis said, and then, after a beat that felt deliberate, added, for 7 Bravo, you're in good hands up there. I mean that. Mara didn't answer over the radio. There was nothing to say to it that belonged on an open frequency, with a checklist half finished in front of her and a trim fault that hadn't gone anywhere. But she felt the sentence land somewhere behind her sternum anyway. A small, strange kindness thrown across 190 miles of open ocean by a man she had never met and, until 3 minutes ago, had never heard of. It occurred to her distantly that this was what the job had always been, underneath the checklists and the acronyms. Strangers agreeing, for the length of an emergency, to be responsible for each other. She had forgotten that. Grief had made her forget a great many things about the life she used to have. She was discovering, and not all of them had deserved to be forgotten. They worked the checklist together, Okafor calling items, Mara confirming, both of them slipping, without discussing it, into the old rhythm of crew resource management, the choreography that exists precisely so that no single person has to carry a crisis alone. It occurred to Mara, somewhere over the drone of the engines and the crackle of Hollis's voice giving updated weather for Shannon, that this was the first time in 3 years she had done the thing she used to love most about flying. Not the machine, not the altitude, but this. 2 people, trained the same way, thinking in sync, catching each other's blind spots. Den used to say that flying with a good first officer was like being handed half a brain you could trust completely. She had spent 3 years unable to think about that sentence without wanting to be sick. Now, with Okafor's voice steady and clipped in her headset, despite the blood soaking further through a sleeve, she found the memory arriving without the accompanying wave of grief. It simply sat there, true and warm, a fact about her old life rather than a wound. The captain stirred once, moaned, didn't wake. Priya came in briefly with a first aid kit and a passenger, a retired ER nurse, it turned out, seated in row 6, who took over pressure on Okafor's arm and checked the captain's pupils with a penlight, murmuring numbers Mara didn't have the attention to track. Pupils are reactive equal, Louise said, mostly to herself, mostly to keep her own hand steady. That's good. That's a good sign. He needs a hospital, not a miracle. She glanced at Mara for half a second, taking her measure the way medical people do, quickly and without judgment. You're doing fine, by the way. Whatever you're worried you're not doing right, you're doing it right. Mara hadn't realized until that moment how badly she'd needed someone to say exactly that, a stranger with no stake in her history, simply reporting what she observed. She nodded once, throat too tight for words, and kept her eyes on the instruments, because the instruments did not require her to feel anything about being told she was doing fine. They only required her hands, which, it turned out, were the part of her least confused about what came next. The captain's name, she learned later, was Frank Delgado, 26 years with the airline. For months from retirement, his crew had already started teasing him about. He would wake fully in a Shannon hospital 18 hours later with a concussion and 11 stitches and no memory of the flight past the initial bang. And the first thing he would ask, before anything about his own condition, was whether everyone on his airplane had made it down safely. When they told him a passenger had flown his aircraft in, he would ask her name and repeat it back twice, as though committing it to memory the way you commit the name of someone you intend to thank properly, someday, in person. For 7 Bravo, descend and maintain 4,000. Turn left heading 090. Your number 1 for Shannon. Runway 24 in use. Wind 210 at 12. Cleared for the approach when established. Hollis's voice, all procedure now. Descending 4,000, left 090, for 7 Bravo, Mara said, and heard her own voice fall into the old cadence without effort. The read-back rhythm of 100 flights she tried to convince herself she'd never do again. The descent began, cloud thickening and thinning around them in gray ribbons, the airplane shuddering occasionally through pockets of turbulence that Mara felt in her sternum before she felt them in the instruments. An old pilot's habit of the body knowing before the mind confirmed. Behind her, muffled but audible now that the roar of the earlier emergency descent had given way to something closer to ordinary flight noise. She could hear Priya's voice over the cabin intercom, steady and warm, telling passengers they'd begun their approach into Shannon, that emergency crews would be waiting as a precaution, that everyone had done wonderfully and needed only to hold on a little longer. Mara found herself grateful for a voice she could not see, doing for 200 strangers exactly what she was trying to do for the airplane itself, holding a shape steady around something that wanted badly to fall apart. Okafor's hand stayed on the yoke beside hers, a steadying presence more than an active one now, his strength fading with every mile. "Your controls," he said quietly. The two words pilots used to formally transfer command of an aircraft, words that meant, in this case, everything. "My controls," Mara answered, and felt the yoke's resistance change under her hands as the autopilot disengaged and the airplane became, entirely, hers to fly. For a moment, nothing existed except the instruments in front of her, and the faint tremor running up through the yoke into her wrists, the airplane's way of telling her, in the only language it had, that something in its own body was broken and needed a steady hand to compensate. She thought, unbidden, of Dan teaching a nervous student once years ago, in a much smaller plane on a much calmer day, saying, "An airplane will always tell you the truth, if you're willing to feel it instead of just look at it." She had rolled her eyes at him for saying something that sounded like it belonged on a motivational poster. She understood it now in a way she never had before, both hands full of an airplane telling her, plainly, exactly where it hurt. Louise, the nurse, had wedged herself into the cockpit's jump seat behind them, keeping steady pressure on Okafor's arm with a professional economy of motion that left her free to watch the instruments too, murmuring updates on his pulse that Mara filed away without looking, trusting the woman to say something the moment it mattered. It was, Mara thought, exactly the kind of trust flying had always required, and that grief had convinced her she could no longer extend to anyone. The trust that other people, doing their own jobs well, would let you do yours. The trim fault made itself known almost immediately, a persistent pull to the left that she had to counter with steady pressure, a wrestling match with the machine that required not force but patience, small continuous corrections rather than panic. It was, she realized with something like grim humor, exactly like everything else in the last 3 years, not one dramatic fight, but 1,000 small ones, over and over, until your arms ached with it. Through the windscreen, gray Atlantic cloud gave way slowly to the green coast of Ireland, and somewhere below and ahead, invisible yet, was a runway with fire trucks already rolling into position because Hollis had made the calls the moment the diversion was declared. For 7 Bravo, Shannon Tower, runway 24, cleared to land. Wind 210 at 14, emergency equipment standing by. A new voice now, tower rather than approach, closer, more immediate. Mara's hands were shaking. She noticed distantly, though the airplane in them was not. That struck her as important, somehow, that fear and steadiness could exist in the same body at the same time, that you did not have to stop being afraid in order to do the thing you were afraid of. She had believed, for 3 years, that competence required the absence of grief. Sitting in that seat with the runway growing larger in the windscreen, she understood this had never been true. She had simply never tested it. The last few miles were the hardest. The trim fault worsened as they slowed for landing configuration, the airplane's nose wanting to wander left with a persistence that took real physical effort to counter, and Okafor, blood loss finally catching up with him, called out flap settings and gear commands in a voice growing thinner by the minute. "Gear down," Mara said. "Gear down, 3 green," Okafor confirmed, checking the indicator lights with the last of his focus. "You're stable, Mara. Airspeed's good. Just fly the numbers." Fly the numbers. It was a thing Dan used to say to nervous student pilots when he did contract instructing on the side, back before the accident. A way of saying, don't think about everything at once. Don't think about the weight of 200 people or the length of the runway, or what happens if you're wrong. Just fly the numbers. One instrument, one correction, one moment at a time. Mara had not thought about that phrase in 3 years. She thought about it now, and let it steady her hands instead of breaking her heart, and understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful in the middle of chaos, That this was the difference between carrying grief and being crushed by it. You could let a memory fly the airplane with you, instead of letting it keep you on the ground forever. The runway filled the windscreen. Mara held the descent rate, fought the trim's leftward pull with steady, unhurried pressure, watched the numbers, airspeed, sink rate, alignment, with the total, absorbed focus she used to love more than almost anything in her life. 50 feet, Okafor said, voice barely above a whisper now. 40. 30. She flared the aircraft at the right moment, not too high, not too late, the old muscle memory arriving exactly when she needed it. And the main gear touched the runway at Shannon with a firmness that was solid rather than harsh, a landing that any Czech airman would have called a good one. She held the nose off a beat longer, then let it settle, and brought the aircraft to a stop on the center line with the fire trucks already rolling alongside, lights sweeping red and white across the wet runway. For one full second, nobody in the cockpit said anything at all. Then Okafor exhaled, long and shaking, and said, "Nice landing," in a voice that cracked in the middle of the second word. And the ER nurse behind them said something urgent about getting him to the paramedics now. And the cabin behind the cockpit door erupted, faintly, into the sound of 200 people beginning, all at once, to cry and laugh and thank whatever they individually believed in. Mara sat with her hands still on the yoke for a moment longer than she needed to, feeling the engine spool down, feeling the enormous physical relief of a body that had been braced for hours, finally allowed to unclench. Through the side window, she could see emergency vehicles converging, could see past them green Irish fields under a gray afternoon sky, ordinary and impossibly beautiful. The next hour moved in a strange, adrenaline-blurred way that Mara remembered from every real emergency she'd ever handled. Full of motion, and yet somehow slow, every detail vivid and disconnected from the ones around it. Paramedics took the captain off on a stretcher, stable, already beginning to stir toward consciousness, murmuring words nobody could quite understand yet. Okafor went next, and for already in his uninjured arm, insisting, even as they wheeled him away, on telling the airport's ground crew exactly what he thought had failed in the door seal, professional to the last possible second. Passengers filed off in a hush punctuated by sudden bursts of emotion, a man hugging a stranger in row 9, the boy from across the aisle running, without quite meaning to, straight into his mother's legs and holding on. Out on the tarmac, through the small side window, Mara watched the boy from across the aisle being carried down the mobile stairs on his father's hip, his face buried in his father's shoulder, one small hand still clutching the silent handheld game, as though letting go of it might let go of the whole afternoon too. The man in the suit who'd been annoyed about his headphones 2 hours ago was crying openly now, unashamed, being steadied by a stranger's hand on his back. Mara recognized the particular texture of that kind of crying, not devastation, but its opposite, the body's blunt, unglamorous way of processing the fact that it was still, against reasonable odds, alive. She had cried like that exactly once before in a hospital corridor 3 years ago, though for entirely different reasons, and it struck her, standing at the cockpit window watching strangers weep with relief on a wet Irish runway, that grief and survival used almost exactly the same muscles. Maybe that was why she had been so afraid, for so long, to use either of them again. Mara stayed in the cockpit longer than she needed to, filling out on autopilot, the kind of informal notes a pilot leaves for the people who come after. Altitude, timing, what the trim had done, and when, because some part of her simply could not stop being useful yet, did not know how to switch that part of herself back off. It was Priya who finally came and found her there, crouched in the doorway the way she'd crouched at seat 22C hours before, and said gently, "You can stop now. You did it. You can stop." Mara looked up at her, and something in her chest that had been locked for 3 years came loose all at once, without warning, the way the cabin's pressure had come loose over the Atlantic, not gradually, but suddenly, entirely. "My husband died in a simulator," she heard herself say, to a flight attendant she'd known for 4 hours, in a stopped airplane on a runway in Ireland. 3 years ago. He was a pilot. I haven't touched a set of controls since. Priya didn't say anything comforting or practiced. She just sat down in the empty captain's seat beside her, out of uniform posture entirely now, just a tired woman who'd also nearly died that afternoon, and said, "Well, you touched them today. Mara laughed, a startled, wet sound half-sob. I did. What was his name? It was the question nobody had asked her in 3 years. Not really, everyone always asked how she was doing, or how she was holding up, careful, circling questions that let her avoid the center of it. Nobody asked his name, as if saying it might hurt her, as if it hadn't been the best word she knew for 4 years of her life. Dan, Mara said. Daniel Reyes. Saying it out loud in that cockpit, in the specific quiet of an airplane that had nearly killed everyone on it, and hadn't, felt like something breaking that needed, badly, to break. Not the plane this time, not the pressure seal, but the thing in her chest that had been holding its breath since a hospital corridor 3 years ago. She said his name again, quieter, just to hear it in her own voice, and found that it did not destroy her the way she had always been afraid it would. It just sat there, true, a fact about a man she had loved, not a wound she had to keep hidden to survive. She found Sean Hollis 2 days later, not by accident. Shannon's airport authority had asked her, along with Okafor once he was stable enough for interviews, to sit through a preliminary debrief with the investigating team. Standard practice after any incident this serious, and it was there, in a conference room that smelled like burnt coffee, that she learned the controller who had guided them and had asked to be part of the process too. An unusual request that the airport had granted because everyone involved understood, by then, that this had not been an ordinary day for anyone. The debrief itself was long and procedural, a careful walk through the timeline by investigators who were kind but exacting, reconstructing minute by minute what had happened from the first bang to the final stop on the centerline. Mara answered every question plainly, surprising herself with how little difficulty she had describing the trim fault, the readings, the specific pressure of the yoke fighting her hands. The words came easily because they were simply true, and because, for the first time in 3 years, she was allowed to say them out loud to people whose job was to listen carefully rather than to worry about her feelings. There was something almost restful in that. Grief, she was learning, made people around you flinch and soften their questions. A formal investigation did not flinch at all, and in its bluntness, she found an unexpected kind of relief. Okafor was there too, his arm in a sling, pale but steady, and the two of them fell without discussing it into the same clipped, cooperative shorthand they'd used in the cockpit, finishing each other's timelines, correcting each other's small misremembered details with the easy trust of people who had already been through the worst thing together and had nothing left to prove to one another. At one point, describing the final approach, Okafor said simply, she flew it like she'd never stopped, and Mara had to look down at the table for a moment before she trusted her voice enough to keep going. He was younger than his voice had suggested, maybe 35, with a specific tiredness in his eyes of someone who had spent a career listening to other people's worst days through a headset. He recognized her the moment she walked in. She saw it happen, the small shift in his face, and after the debrief formally ended, he found her in the hallway. I should have said something different up there, he said, about knowing your call sign. It wasn't the moment. I'm sorry. You said the right thing, Mara said, and meant it. You said I'd do fine. I needed someone to say that, and I don't know if I'd have believed it from anyone who didn't know why it mattered. Hollis nodded slowly. I worked evening approach out of the base you two flew from, before I transferred out here. Never met you in person, but everybody on that frequency knew the Voss Reyes crew pairing. Best coordinated crew we ever vectored, people used to say. I remember when the accident happened. Whole facility went quiet for a shift. Mara felt the old grief rise, familiar now, less like a wave that would drown her, and more like whether she knew how to stand in. I quit flying after, she said, for 3 years. I told myself it was because I couldn't do it without him. Turns out that wasn't really true. I could do it. I was just afraid of finding that out. You found out anyway, Hollis said. The hard way, from what I hear. The hard way, she agreed. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, she smiled without effort, without performing steadiness for someone else's benefit. It was simply there, unforced, the way relief sometimes arrives after a long illness. Not a cure, but proof the body still knew how to heal. They stood together for a moment in the hallway, the ordinary fluorescent hum of an airport administrative wing around them, and Hollis, who had the look of a man deciding whether to say one more thing, finally said it. For what it's worth, I looked up the accident report on your husband's simulator years back out of curiosity. Before I ever thought I'd meet you. It wasn't a small failure. Cascading electrical fault, backup systems that should have caught it and didn't because of a manufacturing defect nobody had reason to suspect. I only mention it because I know what it's like to sit with a thing like that and wonder if there was some version of the world where you saw coming. There wasn't. I've read 100 reports like it in this job. Sometimes the machine just fails, and it isn't anybody's fault. And that's the whole answer, unsatisfying as it is. Mara had heard some version of this sentence a dozen times over the past 3 years, from investigators, from grief counselors, from well-meaning friends who wanted badly to make the unbearable make sense. It had never once landed the way it landed now, from a stranger who worked with mechanical failure for a living and understood, in his bones, that unfairness and randomness were not the same as meaninglessness. "Thank you," she said, and found she meant it completely. "Least I could do," Hollis said, "for the Vos Reyes crew pairing, even if it's only half of it flying these days." "Maybe not only half," Mara said, surprising herself. "I've been thinking I flew that approach with more than just an unconscious captain and a bleeding first officer helping me. I don't know how to explain it better than that." Hollis didn't ask her to explain it better. He just nodded, the nod of someone who had spent a career listening to pilots describe things that didn't fit neatly into after-action reports, and said, "I believe you. I've heard stranger things over a headset." The investigation into the door seal failure took 4 months to close, and Mara sat through more of it than she strictly needed to, not because anyone required her presence, but because she found, to her surprise, that she wanted to understand exactly what had happened to the aircraft she had flown that day. Wanted the whole story, mechanical and human both, rather than the fragments she'd lived through in real time. The final report attributed the failure to a fatigue crack in a door seal mechanism that had passed its last 2 inspections, a small, ordinary, mechanical unfairness with no villain in it at all, which she found, oddly, easier to live with than a villain would have been. Something simply broke. It didn't mean the people who flew through the breaking had done anything wrong, and it didn't mean the plane, or the sky, or the world owed anyone an explanation beyond that. Her mother's 70th birthday happened, eventually 6 weeks later than planned, at the rented villa on the Portuguese coast. The whole family gathered around a long outdoor table under strings of warm lights. Mara told them the story that night, all of it, for the first time out loud to people who loved her rather than to strangers filling out incident reports. The decompression, the cockpit, Okafor's blood-soaked sleeve, Hollis's voice on the radio saying her old call sign like a small, unlooked-for gift. She told them about Dan too properly, for the first time in 3 years, not as a wound she was protecting them from, but as a man she had loved and missed and was still, in her own way, married to, even now. Her mother cried. So did Mara. Nobody tried to stop either of them, and the crying passed the way it does into something quieter and more bearable, and then into ordinary laughter over dessert, the way an evening can hold both without contradiction if you let it. Mara did not go back to commercial flying, not right away, and maybe not ever in the exact shape her old career had taken. But 3 months after Shannon, sitting in her mother's kitchen in Chicago with the villa trip long since rescheduled and finally taken, she filled out an application to renew her lapsed instructor rating. Not to fly cargo again, not to chase the old life back into its old shape, but because somewhere over the Atlantic she had remembered what it felt like to be the calm in the center of someone else's fear, and had found she did not want to give that feeling up a second time out of grief. Alone. She kept on her desk a small printed photograph from the Shannon incident report, not of the airplane, but of the crew roster from that flight. Her own name typed in beside Okafor's and the captain's, official and small and undeniable. Some evenings she looked at it and thought of Dan, and the thought no longer arrived like a blow. It arrived like weather that had finally, after 3 long years, begun to clear. Okafor recovered fully and sent her, some months later, a photograph of his daughter's first day of school, with a note that read only, "Your hands worked. Mine too, eventually. Thank you for both of ours." Mara kept that too, pinned beside the crew roster. 2 small proofs that a single terrible afternoon could still leave something worth keeping behind it. Louise, the retired nurse, wrote once as well, a short letter that ended with a line Mara read a dozen times before she understood why it had stayed with her. "I've spent 40 years watching people find out what they're made of in emergency rooms. It was strange and wonderful to watch someone find it out in a cockpit instead, and to get to hold the pressure bandage for it. Mara wrote back and told her the truth, that she hadn't found out anything new about herself that day so much as remembered something she'd already known and buried, which was, she thought, probably the more common story, even if it made for a less tidy one. She never flew with Sean Hollis's voice in her headset again, not directly. Though she thought sometimes, on clear nights, of all the pilots out there right now being talked down through storms and failures and fear by strangers who would never meet them, who would only ever be a voice saying you're going to do fine at the exact moment someone needed to hear it most. She wondered sometimes whether that was simply what love looked like when you stretched it out thin enough to cover strangers, competence, offered freely, at the exact moment someone couldn't hold the weight alone. It was not so different, she thought, from what she and Dan had once done for each other in cockpits of their own, and it did not feel like a lesser thing for being offered to strangers instead. If anything, it felt like proof that what she and Dan had built together hadn't ended with him. It had simply gone looking for new places to land. A year later, almost the day, Mara stood in front of a small class of student pilots at a flight school outside Chicago. 3 of them barely out of their teens, one of them a woman in her 50s, starting over after a career in something else entirely. All of them watching her with the particular nervous attention of people about to be taught something that might, someday, matter more than they currently understood. She had told them, at the start of course, a shortened version of the Shannon story, not because she needed them to be impressed, but because she wanted them to understand something about the work before they ever touched a set of controls. That flying was not the absence of fear, and competence was not the absence of grief, and that the two things people were often taught to keep separate, the steady hands and the breaking heart, could, in fact, occupy the exact same body at the exact same moment, and that this was not a flaw in the design. It was, if anything, the whole point. "Your controls," she said to the woman in her 50s that afternoon, in a small training aircraft climbing steadily over the flat gray fields west of the city, and felt, as she always did now, saying those 2 words, a small quiet echo of Okafor's voice in a headset over the Atlantic, and beneath that, further down, an older echo still, of a man who had taught her almost everything she knew about flying, and had never once gotten to see her use it without him. "My controls," the student said, hands tightening on the yoke, voice unsteady with the particular fear of a first real turn, and Mara watched her take it anyway. Watched the airplane bank gently under a stranger's still uncertain hands, and thought, not for the first time that year, that this was as close to a definition of hope as she was ever likely to find. Someone afraid, doing the thing anyway, because someone beside them believed, out loud, that they could. The cabin had lost pressure at 30,000 feet, and for 3 long years before that day, Mara Voss had been the one holding her breath, not the airplane, not the passengers, but her, in a life she had sealed shut against grief the way an aircraft seals itself against the thin, unbreathable air outside. It had taken an emergency to crack that seal open. But once it was open, she found, to her own quiet astonishment, that she could breathe again, not despite what she had lost, but carrying it, steady, in hands that had never actually forgotten how to fly. End.